So, in this second video, I'm going to talk specifically about the idea of peace journalism as a contribution to debates about the significance of culture and communication as factors in the development of conflict and the prospects for peace. And to take up where I left off in the previous video, if it is the case that it is characteristics of media that are now going to prove influential on the content of things like struggles for liberation. They're going to influence parties to conflict to shift the focus of their struggle in order to concentrate on issues that lend themselves to being mediated. Then, of course, it is the characteristics of media themselves that are the next thing for us to concentrate on. What is it about media conventions, media preferences, media structures, media networks and so forth? What is it about these things that exerts particular kinds of influence on both the conduct and the content of things like struggles for liberation? And what kind of message does the media send back to parties to conflict for them to work on in order to generate more content for this ever more extensive mediascape in which we are all every day immersed? And the case for peace journalism begins really in an essay published over 50 years ago now by Johann Galtung with a collaborator, Murray Holmberger, which is quite well known in communication studies, and it's called The Structure of Foreign News. Now, in brief terms, the structure of foreign news strongly suggested that the content of news reporting about conflicts and crises is itself not really a property of the intrinsic qualities of the conflicts or crises being reported, so much as something which is strongly influenced, perhaps even determined, by the structures of media. And the essay nominates several what it called tuning factors, which are highly influential on the content of news. And let me share with you one or two of them on this slide. If I home in a bit there, you can see. The upper picture is of a US camera crew embedded with a forward operating unit in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And the lower picture, as you will recognise, is fighters from what was then called the ISIS organisations, now metastasised further into Islamic State, of course, in the same territory, Iraq, a few years later. But the gap between them is intended to represent the period when, so far as mainstream media in the troop supplying countries were concerned, Iraq effectively went quiet as a story. And in the essay, Galtung and Ruger suggest that people act on their image of reality, therefore very much in keeping with what we've been saying, and media are a strong contender for being the number one image former. Now, of these tuning signals that determine newsworthiness, three, I think, are of most interest to us. Threshold, a big story affecting a large number of people, usually connected with the home audience or readership of the media, for obvious reasons. Frequency, this is an interesting one. Because in those days the dominant form of media was daily newspapers, then there's a strong bias in their reporting in favour of events that have happened with a clear beginning, middle and end during the 24 hours that elapse between editions. And the third of these particular ones that I've picked out is negativity. Bad news is more exciting than good news. And what that means is that the reporting of conflict in the media is often geared towards a series of big bangs, bombs, bullets and battles. And that is something which gives rise to a dominant form which Galtung later called war journalism, meaning not merely the job of war reporting, as it would be referred to in a lot of newsrooms, that is, reporters who cover wars, but also journalism which in some kind of ways influences the formation of images or perhaps prompts us to make meanings which somehow naturalise and legitimise further violence. That is, they lead us or leave us to assume that more violence will be an appropriate, perhaps inevitable response to the problem as portrayed in the original reporting. And they do that because they exclude the process that leads up to the events. They exclude the process that leads up to the events because that process is something gradual. It's something which takes shape in small increments over time. So it's very difficult to point to the precise ways in which it has changed in the interval between editions, and therefore it's less newsworthy. So this is quite a significant influence that media exert over the behaviour of parties to conflict. If they want to take their struggle into symbolic domains, they may very well be incentivised by these media conventions to produce a big bang or a dramatic event, in particular a negative one, which meets these conventions of threshold, frequency and negativity, and therefore the prevalence of war journalism in the media may be influencing parties to conflict to engage in these forms of violence. And that may indeed be a factor in the calculus of the so-called Islamic State organization and some of the attacks attributed to it in Europe and elsewhere. Let's move further on then, and here is the basic headings of what Galtung later proposed as the remedial form of peace journalism. So if there's going to be a dominance of war journalism, and if that's going to be a problem, that problem requires a solution, and the solution could be peace journalism. So where the dominant war journalism form is war or violence orientated, because it is hooked on this diet of big bangs, okay, then well, peace journalism will be peace and conflict orientated. That is to say, showing you something of the process that leads up to the events, and therefore exposing opportunities, shall we say, to intervene in that process, to switch the course of the conflict away from violence and towards peace instead. War journalism, he argued, was propaganda orientated, inclined to take the words of people in power at face value, and therefore also elite orientated. So peace journalism has to be truth orientated and people orientated. That is, trying to pick up peace initiatives from whatever level at any time. And fundamentally, the picture we get of conflicts from the dominant war journalism is of this kind of titanic struggle, usually between two parties contesting the single goal of victory, where it can only end with one of them winning and the other losing. So you can understand how to the extent that logic begins to seep into the actions and motivations and the calculations of parties to conflict, then its influence can indeed be in favour of escalating violence. Because if you are not unambiguously winning, then you risk being reported in the media as losing, because they seem to be the only two alternatives. Whereas peace journalism would try to open up a sense that a conflict is a shared problem, full of highly identifiable and understandable relations of cause and effect, and therefore interventions are possible to improve things to the extent to obviate violence and instead move the whole towards a more solution-orientated kind of understanding. So these are some of the aspirations for peace journalism, lofty ones you may think, and just to say that peace journalism has been taken up and extended over many years now through such means as journalist training for editors and reporters in conflict zones. The connections that we've been touching on here are recognised now to some extent in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which have a specific goal of peace. Peace is now viewed in the UN system as indispensable to development and vice versa. So building peaceful and inclusive societies is one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's SDG 16 out of 17. And each of the goals has certain targets listed underneath it, And one of the targets for SDG 16 is about ensuring public access to information. So it's usually illustrated with rather kind of colourful. Oh, that's a little slide about where peace journalism has been done through things like journalist training. There it is. There's the little map there, a little diagram of the Sustainable Development Goals. So Target 1610 is to ensure public access to information as part of a way to build development and peace. And that is a cue, as you may imagine, for lots of people involved in what is sometimes called the peace journalism movement, to want to step up their efforts to promote peace journalism as a way to shape and influence the supply of information to publics in such a way as to prompt and enable them to consider and value non-violent solutions to conflict. So peace journalism, it could be said, indeed, I might say, is an idea whose time has come.